Hello, this is Gerard Perry, and on this episode of Books, Music, and News Review, we'll be going over a few elections, one that was recently held, and a few others that are upcoming. I'd like to focus at the start of the show on the recent Israeli election, and there are a number of interesting aspects of this election, one of them being the fact that it was held almost immediately after the previous Israeli election, because Israel is a for a set number of seats in the Israeli parliament known as the Knesset. So you almost never have a situation where either Labor or the Likud, regardless of how popular they are, will be able to command a majority in the parliament. So they'll have to cobble together coalitions, usually either, in the case of a Likud, religious, right, fundamentalist Orthodox parties and some nationalist parties that align with their policies. And in the case of Labor, depending on the situation, left-wing parties that support them but garnered a smaller share of the vote. And the problem with the last Israeli election was that Avigdor Lieberman, who's the head of a right-wing party comprised mostly of Russian immigrants to Israel, people who left the former Soviet Union and are, for the most part, very secular and resent the power exercised by the Orthodox Haredi community over Israeli politics. He decided to break away from Netanyahu. A lot of people accused him of grandstanding, of being very self-aggrandizing and trying to become a power broker through this or enhance the prospects for his party, which is called Yisrael Beitenu. And this decision prompted the chaos which precipitated this past Israeli election, because without his support, Netanyahu didn't command a majority in parliament. And the interesting thing about this election, or one of the interesting things, was the divide. You had Netanyahu and Likud facing Benny Gantz, a retired general who represented the blue and white coalition. And it was an attempt by Labor to model themselves as a patriotic Zionist party that was standing opposed to Netanyahu, who's generated a lot of enemies in his decade or so as prime minister. He's one of the longest-serving prime ministers of Israel. And he's been the bête noire for not only the mainstream media, newspapers like Haaretz and other left-wing journalists, but also the political part of the political establishment, which is on the left, particularly within the national security apparatus, Shin Bet, and parts of the military. And in fact, it's somewhat analogous to the situation in the U.S., where you have a president who's resented to a large degree by the establishment, even within the national security and the intelligence establishment. Just like in Israel, just like in the U.S., Israel has an intelligence community and a national security establishment, at least the leadership, that's very antagonistic towards the policy ends but even more so the personality of the leader, in this case Benjamin Netanyahu. So you had this was one of the interesting threads of this Israeli election. But the other, as I mentioned, the other main theme was a divide between the religious Orthodox establishment and the majority of Israel, which is for the most part secular, non-religious Jews who don't like the power exercised by the Orthodox. They were granted a lot of benefits initially at the inception of the State of Israel because this community was very small. Most of the Hasidic and Orthodox Jews, over 2/3, were exterminated during the Holocaust. So when Israel was established, this was a very small, minuscule part of the overall body politic. So people like David Ben-Gurion and the Israeli state gave them certain benefits. And as they grew, they were actually able to lobby for and attain even wider benefits, particularly when it comes to deferment from compulsory military service. In Israel, military service or national service is mandatory for all Jews, and also I believe now Druze are also part of this requirement to serve in national service. It applies to both men and women. Israeli Arabs are exempt, of course, for the most part, even though there are a number of Israeli Arabs that serve in the IDF. But they were able to get the political establishment to grant them deferments, and this has been a controversial issue which has been litigated repeatedly in the Israeli courts. But the fact that they now are a large minority within the Israeli public means that they have the power to exercise influence to make or break governments, and this was one of the key issues of this past campaign. And even now, after the second inconclusive election where the two main parties essentially it was essentially a draw, they're still influential in deciding what the composition of the next government is going to be. There's some who believe that there should be a national unity government, but the antipathy towards Netanyahu and having him continue as prime minister from the opposition would probably, combined with Lieberman's hostility towards the religious Orthodox parties, would probably mitigate against any sort of arrangement like that, any sort of grand coalition. But one of the interesting things about this election, and one of the interesting things is the persistent popularity of Netanyahu. Even though he's had critics on both the left and the right, he's managed to maintain control, leadership of not only the Likud but of Israel over the past decade, largely because he's brought somewhat stability for the most part, even though there were times such as the 2000 and there have been times such as conflict between Israel and terrorist groups like Hamas, that there would be outbreaks occasionally of full-scale and hints of war. There has never really been a catastrophic war that's marred Netanyahu's prime ministership. There hasn't been even moments when particularly the south of Israel has been bombarded by Qassam rockets, and there have been attacks by Hezbollah. There hasn't been a third intifada, and Israel has more or less been able to maintain internal security and a seemingly stable economy, despite the militant opposition to Netanyahu of progressive Israelis and the Israeli national security establishment. And I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that even though the conditions are much different, there is a thread that connects this with other countries, particularly when you compare the reaction of the public to the reaction of the establishment. And there is a parallel in a certain sense to the warfare between the press and President Trump that we've seen ever since he became a serious contender for president over around approximately 4 years ago. There's been a disconnect between what the press thinks and what the establishment thinks and what the ordinary public thinks. And you can see this throughout the world. And this leads me to a discussion of another election, which is, if not imminent, it's probably going to take place sometime within the next year in Italy, where the government there also recently collapsed after Matteo Salvini, the former interior minister, was ousted, and he's now in the opposition, and the control of the country has basically been ceded to a combination of the Five Star Movement, which was his coalition partner, but also the center-left, pro-EU, very Europhile, very pro-migration faction in Italy. And even though this government has been in power for less than a month or around a month, you can see the drastic difference now that Matteo Salvini no longer has any influence in the government. The migrant ships, which are akin to smuggling or trafficking ships, they're engaged in human trafficking, taking people from North Africa and the Middle East, primarily from ports in Libya. They've been able to dock, now that Matteo Salvini is no longer there, they've been able to dock in Lampedusa, which has been overrun by migrants, and people posing as refugees have overwhelmed this tiny, small island. And now it's more than likely that you see a flood of quote-unquote refugees and migrants coming into Italy now that there's no official opposition to their entrance. And like in America and Israel, the Italian establishment disdains Salvini and did everything in its power to force him to leave, even though it was a bit of a power gambit by Salvini himself that precipitated this. It was also the unwillingness of the establishment to tolerate what he was doing, pushing away from a centralized European federal state, and the consequences of that, which in Italy's case meant being bombarded by tens of thousands of immigrants from North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and other sources, which are using the country of Libya in the chaotic aftermath of the removal of Muammar Gaddafi. They're using that as a staging point for ships coming into Italy and into Greece, and especially the islands bordering these countries. They're using this as a staging point in the Mediterranean to go into Europe. And it's hard to speculate what exactly is going to happen in Italy, but based on what's happening now, you would have to conclude that Salvini is only going to become more popular, especially when people compare what was happening in Italy while he was interior minister and while La Lega had power, some power in the government to influence immigration and migration decisions. Compare that to what's happened in the very short time when he's been ousted from power, which has allowed thousands of people from Africa, from the Middle East, from all sorts of other countries to come into Italy to use the Mediterranean as to use Libya as a staging point to come to Italy, and from Italy perhaps to other parts of Europe. And I'd just like to contrast this a little bit with the election that's going to take place in the next 2 weeks in Canada. Of course, the most notorious aspect of this election are the pictures of Justin Trudeau. So far, there have been 3 of them, which most people have probably seen if they've noticed anything about the Canadian election. These pictures of Justin Trudeau in blackface and in dressing up as what he says is Aladdin, also in blackface, from a period from his mid to late 20s. And the thing is, this reinforces a pre-existing conception of Justin Trudeau as a political lightweight, someone who's embarrassing to Canada and doesn't really have the stature to be the leader of Canada, where the job of prime minister is considered almost a crucial aspect of Canadian identity, particularly abroad, when they go abroad and they meet with other leaders of other nations. And this incident particularly highlights that weakness of Trudeau, because it reminds people of him dressing up in ridiculous ceremonial Indian garb when he visited Prime Minister Modi in India, or dressing up in a headdress when he visited First Nations people in Canada. And it simply reinforces this perception of him as this dilettantish, not very serious person, notwithstanding the racial connotations that it has, dressing up in blackface in the 21st century. And one of the interesting things is that this particular scandal has probably been more newsworthy in the United States than it has been in Canada, because, again, the media there is very sympathetic to Justin Trudeau, even if they don't hold him in high esteem personally. They still view the Liberal Party and his version of Canada, which includes mass immigration from the Third World and more official multiculturalism and opposition to domestic energy production, things like the tar sands. They view this as essential, and defending it as more important than being consistent or having a consistent view on things like this, which is why you have the governor of North Virginia, Ralph Northam, is still in office. Many months after it was exposed that he took a picture of himself in blackface next to someone dressed as a Ku Klux Klansman. And even though the media would normally savage anyone, particularly if they were a Republican or a conservative, they would savage them and mercilessly attack them until they resigned. He's still managed to retain power in Virginia. And it points up the hypocrisy of the establishment, which is supporting people who espouse a line of multiculturalism and support for diversity, while in private being the biggest of hypocrites when it comes to these issues. And it'll be fascinating to see how the Canadian election turns out, because you do have a swelling resentment of Justin Trudeau in the wake of this, particularly in the Atlantic provinces and places like Ontario, Newfoundland, and Labrador, and of course in Western Canada, which already resents him because of the fact that he has thwarted production of domestic energy. One of the greatest resources of Canada is producing oil, and he's obstructed and will probably be even more obstructionist in the future if his party's return to power. So Western Canada, which relies on this natural resource, already resents him, and he's becoming increasingly unpopular in places like Ontario, which is a huge part of any sort of electoral base that he would need to return to power. But he's banking on the fact that he can count on his popularity in Quebec to retain power. Of course, Justin Trudeau's father was Pierre Trudeau, one of the most famous and infamous prime ministers of the Canadian prime ministers of the 20th century, who was known in Quebec, in contrast to the rest of Canada, he was known in Quebec for brutally cracking down on the FLQ and Quebec separatists, nationalists, and particularly a terrorist group, the FLQ, which was a pro-independence, pro-French terrorist group in the province of Quebec. And he circumscribed certain civil liberties and did other things in order to crush them. And there's still a large segment of the population of Quebec that resents him and resents the Trudeau family for the things that he did during the 1970s. And even so, Justin Trudeau is from Quebec, and he was a parliamentarian there, so he still retains a degree of popularity. And in order to compensate for all of the losses he was sustained in the rest of Canada, he would have to perform exceptionally well in this one province. And he's banking on the indifference of Quebecers to the blackface scandal to allow him to win, and also his lack of stridency in opposing a local law which bans religious head coverings. It's primarily aimed to stop hijabis and Muslim women who wear hijabs from public services. And having the headscarf become a symbol of Quebec. And even though Justin Trudeau, in keeping with his multiculturalist, militantly pro-Islam platform, is opposing this law, he also realizes that he can't do it that stridently because he can't afford to alienate this province, which is his last hope of retaining power. So he has offered some bland and almost non-committal, but very bland opposition to this law, and hoping that he'll be returned to power. So that, and the general indifference of most Quebecers to the blackface scandal, is what he hopes will return him to power. And one of the interesting things about the Canadian election is the fact that, like Israel, it's a multi-party parliamentary democracy, and even though you have two main parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, you also have two other very powerful minor parties, the Bloc Québécois, which is a nationalist, pro-French Quebec party, and the NDP. The NDP is a left-wing counterpart to the Liberals, led now by Jagmeet Singh, who's a Sikh and is the first Sikh to head a major party in Canada, but otherwise has no real distinctive features other than being a critic of Justin Trudeau to his left. So you have the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, and those are the four main parties in Canada. The Bloc Québécois, of course, doesn't have any power to elect a prime minister because they only run in that single province. So even if they won every single seat in Quebec, they wouldn't be able to elect a prime minister from their party unless all of the other parties split exactly evenly. There's a hypothetical scenario wherein they could actually elect someone, but the chances of that happening are 1,000,000 to 1. So they're primarily there in order to exert influence and get concessions for their province. So it'll be interesting to see what actually happens in Canada in the future, whether Trudeau is ousted and what that portends for the United States elections coming up in 2020. Usually there is a parallel between what happens in Canadian politics and what happens in American politics. So, for example, Obama was seen as ushering in an era of liberalism, and that helped Trudeau become elected, and that helped Trudeau become prime minister. And Trump was elected after Obama. So whether or not that has any implications for Canada remains to be seen. But we will find out in little under 2 weeks to see if Canada has a new leader or whether Justin Trudeau has been able to weather the scandal and retain power. Well, that's it for this episode. I hope you learned a little bit, and we'll see you next time on Books, Music, and News Review.